They dragged her through the courthouse lobby like a criminal, under the stunned gaze of dozens. No one knew the black woman in the hoodie was actually the newly appointed federal attorney for that very building. One wrongful cuff, one shameful silence from the crowd, was about to unleash a reckoning that would shake the entire system. The marble floor of the federal courthouse gleamed under the morning sun streaming through the tall glass doors. Lawyers in press suits hurried by, clerks carried stacks of files, and the heavy air of authority seemed to hum in every corner. Maya Richardson stepped inside quietly, adjusting the strap of her worn gym bag across her shoulder. She had rushed straight from the fitness center a few blocks away, still in her running shoes, her hair pulled back hastily. A thin line of sweat clung to her brow. She was late, and she knew it. The courthouse was familiar territory, yet today she felt the weight of eyes on her. Not the warm nods she often exchanged in passing, but sharp, curious glances, the kind that lingered just long enough to make her skin prickle. Maya had no folder in hand, no briefcase, no badge displayed. To anyone watching, she might have seemed out of place, but a stranger wandering into the solemn halls of law. She walked quickly, her mind focused on the closed-door meeting she was already running behind for. Her office, her brand-new office, waited upstairs. But the way people looked at her made her jaw tighten. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished wall panel, plain black leggings, a loose gray hoodie, sneakers, and a gym bag that sagged against her side. Not the image of authority, not the image of who she really was. Maya pulled a deep breath and pressed forward, trying to shake off the unease. She had worked too hard, fought through too many walls of doubt to let the stares matter. But the whispers carried, faint and sharp, like needles pricking her back. Does she belong here? Someone muttered under their breath as she passed. Two uniformed officers stood at the base of the grand staircase, their badges glinting under the chandeliers. One of them, a stocky man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, narrowed his eyes at her. The other, younger and leaner, followed his gaze. Maya felt it immediately, like a hand pressing against her chest, suspicion tightening in the air. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and kept walking. The courthouse lobby was crowded that morning. A group of paralegals laughed as they shuffled papers into their folders. A reporter with a notepad lingered near the entrance, and several citizens sat nervously on the benches, waiting for their hearings. Maya moved through them quickly, but she could sense the ripple effect of the officer's eyes trailing her. She reminded herself, not for the first time, that she had earned every right to be there. This was her courthouse now, her jurisdiction. She was not just another face in the crowd. She belonged more than most of the people bustling around her. But at that moment, with her pulse quickening and sweat cooling on her skin, she knew how little that would matter to anyone who had already decided otherwise. As she reached the base of the stairs, a young attorney in a navy blue suit brushed past her. He glanced at her gym bag, then at her hoodie, his expression curling into a smirk. "Lost, are we?" he said softly, his tone dripping with condescension. He didn't wait for an answer, just kept moving, leaving the sting of his words hanging behind. Maya slowed for half a step, then straightened her shoulders. She had heard it all before. Dismissals, doubts, the sharp edge of prejudice dressed up as humor. She had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of a response. But she didn't miss the way the stocky officer's lips tightened into something close to agreement. His hand shifted on his belt as if ready to act. Maya met his stare for the briefest moment, refusing to lower her eyes. Then she turned and started up the staircase. The sound of her sneakers muffled against the carpeted steps. Inside her chest, her heart drummed steadily. She told herself it was only a few more minutes until she reached her office, until she could shut the door and shake off the unease. Still, a voice deep inside whispered that the morning had already begun to tilt in a dangerous direction. The courthouse, the very temple of justice, was not shielding her from suspicion. It was amplifying it. And though she didn't know it yet, the marble halls around her were about to become the stage for a humiliation she would never forget. The echo of Maya's sneakers softened as she climbed the courthouse steps, but the heavy gaze of the two officers at the landing clung to her back like an iron chain. She slowed when she felt the weight of it, then forced her stride to remain even. If there was one thing Maya knew after years of fighting to be heard, it was that lowering her eyes or quickening her pace would only confirm their suspicion. So she kept her head high, though her breath caught tight in her chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice called out, sharp and official. The tone was not a request. Maya stopped mid-step and turned. The older officer, his nameplate reading Harris, was already watching her with a look that carried more judgment than curiosity. He was thick-set, with a square jaw that seemed locked in a permanent scowl, and he carried his authority like a weapon strapped across his chest. Beside him, the younger officer, Blake, shifted slightly, mirroring Harris's suspicion but with less conviction, as though he was following rather than leading. "Yes?" Maya asked, her voice calm but edged with fatigue. "You got business here?" Harris demanded, his eyes flicking to her gym bag, her hoodie, her sneakers. "This floor is not open to the public. Staff and attorneys only." Maya straightened her shoulders. "I do have business here. I'm heading to my office." Blake's brow furrowed. "Office?" Harris snorted quietly, as if the word itself was a joke coming from her lips. "And where exactly would that be? We don't let just anyone wander around these halls, lady. Let's see your badge." Maya blinked. For a split second, she considered reaching into her bag, then remembered she had left her official identification locked in the desk drawer of her office upstairs. She'd meant to grab it yesterday, but had been buried in paperwork late into the evening. She cursed herself silently for forgetting, knowing exactly how it looked now. "My ID is in my office upstairs," she said carefully, aware of the eyes on her. A group of clerks had paused in their tracks nearby, shuffling papers slowly while they listened in. "I just came straight from the gym. I didn't have time to stop." Harris's mouth curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Straight from the gym, huh? Into a federal courthouse? With no badge? That's convenient." Blake stepped a little closer, tilting his head as if trying to measure her story against her appearance. "Which office did you say?" "I didn't," Maya replied evenly. "But it's upstairs. I'll be there for a meeting." The air grew tighter around them, the kind of tension that made even passers-by slow their steps to watch. And then, as though to seal the unspoken verdict, the young attorney in the navy blue suit reappeared at the top of the stairs. He glanced down, saw Maya standing there with the officers, and chuckled under his breath. His voice carried, smug and careless. "She doesn't belong here." The words hung heavy in the space, louder than they should have been, amplified by the murmurs it triggered among the onlookers. Harris's eyes lit with grim satisfaction, as if the attorney's casual cruelty had confirmed what he already believed. Maya turned her head slowly toward the young man. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart burned. He shrugged, lifting a folder from his briefcase. "I'm just saying, folks usually don't walk into federal court in sweats and sneakers unless they're here to make a plea, not a case." His tone was light, joking even, but the bite was unmistakable. Harris grunted in agreement. "You hear that? Even the attorneys here know you don't fit." Blake shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between Harris and Maya. "Maybe we should just check her office," he began, but Harris cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No. Protocol's protocol. No ID, no entry," Harris said firmly. "Rules don't change just because somebody says they've got an office." Maya's jaw tightened. She fought the urge to lash out, to declare herself then and there, to strip away their smug certainty with the truth. But something inside told her the moment wasn't right. Not yet. She needed to hold the line, to measure her words, even as her dignity was stripped thread by thread in front of strangers. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice low but strong. "I've told you, I belong here. My identification is upstairs. If you allow me, I can retrieve it." Harris's eyes narrowed, and for the first time his hand moved toward the cuffs on his belt, not pulling them out yet, but resting there with intention. The gesture alone sent a ripple through the clerks standing nearby. One of them whispered nervously, "Are they really?" Blake cleared his throat. "Sergeant, maybe we should." "Quiet," Harris barked, cutting him off. His gaze stayed locked on Maya. "Lady, you step away from those stairs right now. You're not going anywhere until we figure out exactly what you're doing here." Maya inhaled slowly, holding his stare. She felt the eyes of the crowd drilling into her back. The attorneys, the clerks, the random visitors who had stopped to watch. She could almost hear the verdict they were forming in their heads, based on nothing more than what they saw: a black woman in a hoodie, a gym bag slung over her shoulder, standing in the middle of a federal courthouse without a badge. For a fleeting second, anger flared in her chest, sharp and hot, but she buried it under a layer of calm she had learned to wear like armor. She knew this game. She knew how it worked. She had spent years proving herself to people who thought like Harris and smirked like that attorney upstairs. And though her heart pounded in her ears, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. "I'm not stepping away," she said softly but firmly, "because I have nothing to hide. You're making a mistake." Her words hung in the air, met not with understanding, but with Harris's thin, humorless smile. And in that moment, Maya understood. The marble walls around her might carry the weight of law and justice, but none of it mattered here, not with men who had already decided what she was. The crowd in the lobby seemed to thicken, as if drawn by an invisible thread to the quiet standoff on the marble staircase. Conversations slowed to whispers, briefcases hung loosely in hands, and all eyes found their way to the woman in the hoodie standing against the two officers who had positioned themselves like stone pillars at the bottom step. Maya's pulse beat hard in her ears, but her voice, when she spoke again, came steady, controlled, and clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I told you," she repeated, her words clipped. "My identification is in my office, upstairs." Her composure seemed only to fuel Harris's suspicion. He planted his feet wide, chest puffing slightly, one hand resting on his belt as though the weight of the handcuffs there gave him final authority. "And I told you," he shot back, his voice carrying sharp across the lobby, "no one goes anywhere without showing who they are. You walk in here looking like this and expect us to take your word for it? Doesn't work that way." Blake shifted beside him, his discomfort written across his face. "Sergeant, we could just check with." But Harris silenced him with a glare. "We're not running errands for her story," he said harshly. "If she's got business here, she'd have her credentials like everybody else. End of discussion." The young attorney who had spoken earlier paused at the railing above, looking down at the scene with a smug half-smile. He pulled his phone from his pocket as if he might record it, then slipped it away again, content to watch with idle amusement. To him, this was entertainment. To Maya, it was humiliation dressed as procedure. She swallowed the heat rising in her chest. "This is my courthouse," she said firmly, the restraint in her voice trembling at the edges. "I don't need to prove." Harris took a deliberate step forward, cutting her off. "That's enough. Step away from the stairs." For the first time, a murmur of unease rippled through the gathered onlookers. Some leaned in, as if unwilling to miss a single word. Others averted their eyes, pretending not to witness what was unfolding. And then, from the far side of the lobby, a quiet click of a phone camera cut through the tense air. Miguel Alvarez, a junior clerk with dark hair falling across his forehead, had pulled out his phone. He held it low, the lens angled toward the confrontation, his expression tight with conflict. He had seen enough of these moments to know how they often ended. Quietly swept under the rug, the story retold only by the people left bruised. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed record. Maya noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye. It wasn't comfort, but it was a witness, and in that instant she felt a strange mix of gratitude and dread. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want her morning to become fuel for gossip or worse. But part of her, a part that had been worn raw by years of quiet battles, understood that sometimes the truth needed to be caught in plain sight. Blake cleared his throat again. "Sergeant, maybe we should let her retrieve her ID. If she really has an office here." Harris's jaw locked. "You think I don't know when someone's feeding me a line? I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. She's stalling." He looked back at Maya with a glint in his eye that wasn't just suspicion, but something darker, something eager. "And if you keep resisting, lady, it's going to go a lot worse for you." Maya held his stare, her chest rising with controlled breaths. She thought of the meeting upstairs, of the stack of files waiting for her, of the desk where her ID sat right in the top drawer. She thought of the years it had taken her to get here, of the names whispered behind her back in law school, of the times she had walked into courtrooms only to have her role questioned before she even opened her mouth. She lowered her voice so that only Harris and Blake could hear. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And when you realize it, it will already be too late." Harris laughed under his breath, humorless and cold. "We'll see about that." From the balcony above, the attorney chuckled again, shaking his head. "What I tell you doesn't belong here." His words floated down like ashes, stoking the fire that already burned. Maya turned her eyes away, refusing to feed the satisfaction of his mockery. She knew what they saw. A woman in sneakers, carrying a bag that looked out of place among leather briefcases and polished shoes. A black woman alone in the marble halls of federal power. But she also knew what they didn't see. Not yet. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I'm going to walk upstairs," she said, each word deliberate, "and you're going to regret stopping me." Harris's hand moved from his belt to the cuffs themselves, the metal glinting under the chandelier's light. "Not another step," he ordered. The onlookers froze, waiting, their silence louder than any protest. And as Miguel's phone captured the moment, the set of Harris's jaw, the rigid line of Maya's shoulders, it became clear that what had begun as a misunderstanding was hardening into something far more dangerous, something that would not end quietly. The words, "not another step," hung in the air like a verdict, and for a moment time seemed to stall. The marble lobby, the echo of hurried footsteps and shuffling papers, even the murmurs of the crowd, all of it quieted under the weight of Harris's command. Maya's pulse hammered in her ears. She felt the blood in her veins surge with equal parts fear and fury, yet her face remained calm, her back straight, her hands still visible at her sides. She had been in enough courtrooms to know that sometimes the most dangerous thing wasn't violence, but arrogance dressed in authority. "Sergeant, please," Blake tried again, his voice low, almost pleading. "Let's not do this out here." But Harris was already moving. The metallic snap of handcuffs sliding free from his belt rang across the hall. Heads turned sharply, whispers rose, and a thick tension flooded the space. Maya inhaled slowly, forcing herself not to recoil as Harris stepped close. "This is your last warning," he said, his breath hot with disdain. "Hands where I can see them." Maya raised her hands slowly, palms forward, her hoodie sleeve sliding back to reveal her bare wrist. She hated the gesture, hated the way it made her look small in front of the onlookers, hated the quiet humiliation already pressing on her chest. But she had seen enough people's lives ruined by resisting in moments like this. She knew too well how quickly things could spiral. "Sergeant," she said evenly, "you're making a mistake." He grabbed her arm anyway. The cold bite of steel closed around her wrist with a sharp click. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One woman in a tailored suit covered her mouth. A man with a badge clipped to his lapel muttered, "My God," under his breath. But no one stepped forward. No one moved to stop it. Harris jerked her other arm behind her back, snapping the second cuff into place. Maya stumbled slightly, the strap of her bag slipping off her shoulder and falling to the floor with a dull thud. In that moment, every eye in the lobby was on her, but not a single hand reached to help. "You're under detention for trespassing and suspicious activity," Harris declared loudly, his voice echoing up the staircase as though he were delivering a sentence. The younger attorney on the balcony leaned over the railing, his smirk twisting into something crueler. "Guess she's going to be late for her meeting," he called down, chuckling as though he'd won a bet. Maya closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, drawing her breath steady, clinging to composure with every ounce of strength she had. She opened them again, fixing her gaze straight ahead, refusing to give Harris or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing defeat in her face. Blake hovered nearby, his hands twitching at his sides as if unsure whether to intervene or stand still. His eyes darted to the gathering crowd, then back to Harris, then to Maya's calm but burning stare. "Sergeant, maybe we should," he began, but Harris cut him off with a glare sharp enough to silence him. "Help me escort her," Harris barked instead. Blake hesitated, then reluctantly stepped to Maya's side, though his movements were slower, less certain. He placed a hand lightly on her arm, not gripping but guiding, shot as Harris took the lead. The crowd parted like water as the two officers began moving her toward the side corridor. Some people shook their heads in pity, others in judgment. A few whispered audibly, words like shame, embarrassment. What was she thinking? Each word landed like a stone in Maya's chest. She walked with her head held high, refusing to hunch, refusing to break, but the sting of humiliation burned all the same. She caught sight of Miguel, the clerk, standing near the edge of the lobby. His phone was still in his hand, his knuckles white as he held it steady, recording everything. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, as though to say, "I see you. I won't let this vanish." It was a thin thread of comfort, but Maya clung to it as Harris pulled her roughly forward. The cuffs cut into her wrists, the sharp edges biting her skin with every step. The lobby lights above cast harsh shadows on the polished floor, and in each reflection she saw herself as they wanted her to be, a suspect, a trespasser, a criminal. As they pushed through the side door, the heavy sound of it closing behind her sealed the moment in memory. The courthouse, the very place she had sworn to uphold, had just turned into a stage for her public disgrace. And though she walked in silence, her mind was not silent at all. Inside, a storm raged, anger, sorrow, defiance all knotted together. She knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. But for now, she bore the weight of the cuffs, the sting of humiliation, and the knowledge that every step deeper into that corridor was another step away from the dignity she had spent her life defending. The hallway swallowed her whole as the heavy door slammed behind, muffling the noise of the lobby. The echo of her sneakers scuffed against the polished floor, but the clink of the cuffs on her wrists was louder, harsher, humiliating. Harris walked ahead with the air of someone who thought he had already won. His back rigid, his shoulders squared, not once looking over his shoulder at the woman he had just paraded like a criminal. Blake trailed close, his steps hesitant, his eyes darting toward her with something that looked like regret but never grew into action. Maya kept her head upright, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing it bow. She had felt stares on her before, courtrooms full of jurors, adversaries waiting for her to falter, professors doubting her presence in lecture halls years ago. But nothing like the sting of this silent parade. As she was led down the corridor, clerks peered from doorways, some pausing mid-step with files clutched to their chests. A man in a suit stopped talking on his phone just long enough to watch her pass. No one said anything. No one intervened. Their silence was its own kind of verdict, one she carried like a stone in her chest. The cuffs pinched as her wrists twisted slightly against them, and she winced. Harris glanced back finally, catching the grimace on her face. His smirk deepened. "Not so confident now, huh?" he muttered. Maya steadied her breathing. "Confidence has nothing to do with it," she said quietly. "It's called patience, something you don't seem to understand." Harris's jaw ticked. He turned away, pretending her words hadn't landed, though the stiffening in his shoulders betrayed him. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground as if the tiles had suddenly become fascinating. They turned left into a narrower corridor, the air colder here, the hum of fluorescent lights sharp overhead. Harris opened a door with his keycard and ushered her inside. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork, a holding space with bare walls, 2 plastic chairs, and a table scratched with the marks of 100 restless hands. "Sit," Harris ordered, gesturing toward one of the chairs. Maya sat slowly, deliberately. She leaned back, crossing her legs as best she could with her hands bound behind her. She refused to look small, refused to curl into the shape of someone broken. Blake lingered by the door, his mouth opening then closing again, as if words were trying to claw their way out, but died on his tongue. Harris dropped into the opposite chair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes narrowing at her. "People like you," he said, his voice low, heavy with disdain. "You think you can walk in here, make up a story, act like you belong. But I've been doing this too long. I can smell a lie the moment it hits the air." Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes burned. "Is that what you call it? Experience? I call it arrogance." The remark hit harder than she expected. Harris's face darkened, his hand pressing against the table as if to steady himself. "Careful," he warned. Smart mouths don't get you very far in here. Maya tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle. No, but the truth does. And the truth is, you don't know who you're dealing with. For a long beat, the room fell silent except for the faint buzz of the lights above. Blake looked up then, his eyes flicking between the two of them. He swallowed, shifting his weight. Sergeant, maybe we should just run her name. Could save us time. Harris turned his glare on him. You questioning me, rookie? Blake's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. No, sir, just thinking. Don't. I'm not going to waste resources chasing after some fantasy she's spinning. She doesn't have ID. She doesn't belong. End of story. Maya watched him carefully, her pulse steadying now, a strange calm settling over her like armor. She thought of her office upstairs, of her name engraved on the doorplate that no one here had cared to look for, of the files waiting that bore her signature. She thought of the years clawed out of silence, the sacrifices made, the endless proving and reproving of her worth. And she thought of how quickly all of it could be stripped away, not by law, not by evidence, but by assumption. She leaned forward slightly, meeting Harris's stare with unwavering eyes. You're right about one thing, she said softly. This is a story, but not the one you think. And when it's finished, you won't be proud of the part you played in it. Blake's eyes widened, his hand tightening around the radio on his belt. Harris scoffed, trying to mask the flicker of unease that crossed his face. He pushed back his chair abruptly and stood. Keep dreaming, he muttered, turning toward the door. Maya sat back again, exhaling slowly, her wrists aching against the steel. She stared at the blank wall ahead of her, but she wasn't defeated. Inside, the fire only grew hotter, steadier. The silence of that room wasn't weakness. It was the gathering of a storm, one that Harris could not yet see coming. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant, a holding space that seemed to exist outside of time. Maya sat with her wrists locked behind her back, the hard plastic chair digging into her spine. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead pulsed like a headache she couldn't shake. Across the table, Harris leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her as if her silence were a confession. He hadn't asked a question in several minutes, just stood there, letting the weight of the cuffs and the closed door speak louder than words. Her breathing stayed even, though her wrists ached. She wouldn't let him see the pain. She had been through worse. In law school, she had endured professors doubting whether she had earned her seat in the lecture hall. In court, she had stood alone against attorneys who smirked at her presence until she stripped their arguments apart one by one. Humiliation wasn't new to her, but this, being bound like a criminal inside the very building where her name was etched onto an office door upstairs, was a bitter irony she swallowed in silence. Harris finally broke the quiet. You're awfully calm for someone sitting in cuffs, he said, his voice low, grating, like he wanted to provoke something. Maya lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice steady. I've learned patience. You should try it sometime. His jaw twitched. He leaned closer, placing his hands on the table, his scowl tightening. Patience won't help you here. You're not going to talk your way out of this. You can save your little speeches for the judge when you're booked. The words rolled off her like water against stone. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the rhythm of her breath, refusing to give him what he wanted. Silence became her armor. She could feel his irritation growing with every second she denied him a reaction. The door creaked open, and a sliver of light cut across the room. A woman in her mid-30s stepped in, a stack of files in her arms. She was petite, with sharp eyes behind glasses that missed nothing, her dark hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Maya knew her face. Clara Nguyen, one of the administrative staff who had been bustling around the courthouse since Maya's first day. Clara's gaze flicked from Harris to Maya, lingering on the cuffs, and something changed in her expression. Paperwork for intake, Clara said quickly, setting the files down on the counter near the wall. Her tone was professional, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She adjusted her glasses and glanced back at Maya, recognition dawning slowly, carefully, like a memory pushing its way forward. Harris grunted without looking at her. Leave it on the desk. I'll handle it. Clara hesitated. Her eyes met Maya's again. For a heartbeat, the room fell into a silent exchange. Clara searching for confirmation, Maya holding her gaze with quiet intensity. Maya didn't speak, didn't plead. She just let her eyes say what her mouth could not. You know who I am. Clara lingered longer than necessary, pretending to shuffle through the files as her mind raced. She had seen Maya weeks earlier in a conference with the chief judge. She had processed paperwork with her name across the top, Federal Attorney Richardson. And now, here she was, cuffed in a chair like an intruder. Harris turned back toward the desk, shuffling papers with deliberate indifference. What are you waiting for? Door's that way. Clara swallowed hard. She nodded, but as she stepped out, she left her voice soft enough to carry only to Maya. I'll be back. The door closed again, and Harris didn't notice the promise hidden in her words. He smirked at Maya as though nothing had shifted. Don't look so hopeful, he said. Nobody's coming to save you. Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile, one he mistook for wariness. Inside, her chest tightened with a new current of strength. Someone had recognized her. Someone had seen past the hoodie, the cuffs, the assumptions. For the first time since Harris had dragged her across the lobby, she felt the tide beginning to turn. She leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed calmly on the wall, letting silence reclaim the room. Harris could gloat all he wanted. His arrogance blinded him to the storm already building beyond that locked door. Clara knew, and that knowledge, Maya realized, was a seed of hope too stubborn to be smothered. Clara's footsteps echoed down the hall after she left, fading into the sterile hum of the building. Maya sat still in the chair, her wrists raw from the metal, her back aching, but her eyes steady on the table before her. She had caught it, Clara's glance, the small hesitation, the whisper she wasn't meant to hear. It wasn't certainty, not yet, but it was enough to let her heart beat a little stronger. Harris mistook her silence for defeat. He paced the room like a man waiting for a clock to strike, the swagger in his shoulders loud enough to cover his own doubts. Blake lingered by the door, shifting his weight, his unease growing more visible with each passing minute. He had watched Harris throw cuffs on plenty of people, but something about this didn't sit right with him. The woman in front of them didn't act like the people who lied to save themselves. She carried herself like she knew something he didn't, like she was already 2 steps ahead of the game. But Harris had no patience for those kinds of thoughts, and Blake wasn't brave enough to say them out loud. Not yet. When the door creaked open again, Harris looked up with irritation. Clara slipped back inside, carrying a thin folder this time, her expression carefully neutral. Chief Clerk asked me to deliver this, she said, placing it down on the desk beside Harris. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked to Maya again, the recognition clearer now, sharper. Harris flipped the folder open with a grunt, rifling through the papers without interest. More damn reports, he muttered, tossing them aside. Don't know why they keep sending me this junk. Clara hesitated by the table, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to decide if she could risk speaking. She looked at Blake, saw the uncertainty in his eyes, then back at Maya, whose gaze never wavered. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her throat dry. Harris caught the pause. Something on your mind, Wynn? She straightened quickly. No, Sergeant. Just thought, maybe we should double-check her story. Harris barked a laugh, shaking his head. Her story? Please, every perp's got a story. That's half the job, learning to tune out the nonsense. You don't last 20 years in this uniform by running down every little tale someone feeds you. Clara pressed her lips together. Still, it wouldn't take long to— Enough! Harris snapped. His glare cut like a blade, and Clara fell silent, though her eyes lingered on Maya. It was there in her face now. She was certain. Maya wasn't just some random woman dragged in off the floor. She had seen her, knew her name, her position. But to say it aloud here in this room under Harris's authority felt dangerous. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but sharp. You should listen to her. Harris turned back to her, smirk curling again. And why's that? Because she knows who I am, Maya said simply. The words landed like a stone in still water. Blake's brow furrowed, his eyes flicking from Maya to Clara. Harris froze for only a beat before shaking his head with disdain. That's cute, he muttered. Playing games now, huh? Trying to pit us against each other? He turned to Clara. Get out. I don't need staff clogging up my room. Clara hesitated, her knuckles white as she gripped her file. For a moment, she looked like she might defy him, but the weight of rank pressed down too hard. She nodded, forcing her voice to stay even. "Yes, Sergeant." She turned and slipped out the door, but her eyes caught Maya's one last time, and in that look was a promise. The room fell silent again. Harris muttered under his breath, pacing like a man who wanted the hours to bend to his authority. Blake finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Sir, she might be right. We don't even know her name. What harm would it do to run a check?" The look Harris gave him was enough to pin him to the wall. "I said no. You think I don't know a liar when I see one? You let them spin you around with their stories, you'll end up looking like a fool. She's wasting our time." Maya leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Inside, her chest was a battlefield, rage clashing with restraint, dignity wrestling with the raw sting of humiliation. She could have ended this charade in a sentence, could have spoken her title and demanded the recognition that was rightfully hers. But she knew Harris. Men like him didn't listen. They only doubled down. So she waited. Outside the room, footsteps moved briskly down the corridor. Clara's voice floated faintly, low but firm, speaking to someone with more authority than Harris. The sound was too muffled to catch words, but Maya's pulse quickened. Harris, oblivious, paced on, muttering about paperwork and wasted hours. Blake shifted closer to the door, as if straining to hear what was happening beyond it. For the first time since the cuffs had closed around her wrists, Maya felt the ground shift ever so slightly beneath Harris's feet. A seed of truth had been planted in the cracks of his certainty, and whether he saw it or not, it was already starting to grow. The minutes bled together in that dim room, the fluorescent light buzzing above like a fly that refused to die. Harris's boots tapped impatiently on the linoleum floor as he paced, his jaw set, his eyes occasionally flicking to Maya as though daring her to speak. She didn't. She sat with her wrists pulled back against the cuffs, her shoulders square, her chin lifted just enough to show she wasn't broken. The silence between them had grown so thick that even Blake shifted uncomfortably by the door, unable to stand the weight of it. Finally, Maya exhaled slowly and spoke, her voice level, carrying not desperation but authority. "I want my phone call." Harris stopped pacing, turning toward her with a dry chuckle. "You think you're entitled to anything? You're lucky I even gave you a chair. Phone calls come after booking, not before." Her eyes didn't flinch. "The law guarantees me one." For the first time, something like hesitation flickered across his face, but his pride was louder than reason. He stepped closer, leaning over the table. "And who exactly are you planning to call, huh? Some friend to vouch for your story? You think anyone's going to stick their neck out for you?" Maya met his glare with steady calm. "That's my concern, not yours. Get me the phone." Blake shifted, clearing his throat. "Sergeant, maybe we should let her." "Quiet," Harris snapped, but the edge of doubt crept into his voice now. He stared at Maya for another long moment, her unbroken gaze pressing into him harder than any argument could. Finally, with a curse under his breath, he yanked the phone from the wall and set it on the table in front of her, the receiver dangling. "Fine. Make it quick." Her hands were still bound, and she turned slightly, presenting her cuffed wrists. "You'll need to uncuff me, unless you'd like to dial for me yourself." Harris's nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might refuse. But Blake shifted again, his eyes on the cuffs digging into Maya's skin, and something about the unspoken pressure in the room forced Harris's hand. With a sharp motion, he unlocked the cuffs, muttering as the steel came free. Maya rubbed her sore wrists briefly, then lifted the receiver with practiced calm. She dialed a number she knew by heart, each click of the rotary echoing in the silent room. The line rang once, twice, and then a deep voice answered. "Judge Parker." Maya closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself before speaking. "It's Richardson." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling cut short. The judge's voice sharpened instantly. "Maya, where are you? I've been expecting you upstairs." "I'm at the precinct room downstairs," she said, her voice even though her hands trembled slightly around the receiver. "I've been detained." "What?" His voice boomed through the line. Even Blake straightened at the sound. "By who?" She glanced at Harris, who stood rigid, arms crossed. "Two officers in the lobby. They refused to let me retrieve my identification." The silence on the other end stretched like a taut rope, then snapped with authority. Stay where you are. I'll be down in 2 minutes. The line went dead. Maya placed the receiver gently back in its cradle, her eyes lifting to Harris, who tried to mask the sudden unease in his expression. "Who'd you call?" he demanded, though the forced bravado in his tone couldn't hide the nervous edge. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing the faint red marks on her wrists. "You'll find out soon enough." Blake glanced at Harris, his brow furrowed, the seed of doubt now full grown. "Sergeant," he started, but Harris cut him off again, though his voice lacked the same conviction as before. "Don't get soft. She's bluffing." But the sound of firm footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, cutting off any reply. The door swung open, and Judge Parker filled the frame, his tall figure and commanding presence dwarfing the room. His gray suit was crisp, his eyes sharp as steel, his expression carved in fury. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice thundered against the walls. He scanned the room, his gaze locking first on Maya, then on the two officers. "Why is Miss Jack Richardson sitting here as if she were a suspect?" Harris straightened, his words fumbling for the first time. She didn't have ID. She was acting suspicious. You just handcuffed the United States federal attorney assigned to this courthouse," Parker roared, his voice reverberating through the room like a gavel striking hard wood. "And you dragged her down here like a criminal?" Blake's eyes widened. Harris froze, his mouth half open but empty of words. The color drained from his face as the truth landed like a hammer blow. Maya sat still, her expression calm, but inside her chest burned with both vindication and rage. She hadn't wanted a spectacle, hadn't wanted her authority to be weaponized this way. But the look on Harris's face, shocked, pale, his arrogance cracking, was a moment she would not forget. Judge Parker turned back to Maya, his tone softening only for her. "Are you all right?" She nodded once, her voice low but steady. "I'm fine." "Good," Parker said, then faced Harris again, his fury undimmed. "You'll answer for this." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Harris, stripped of his swagger, stood rigid, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Blake lowered his head, shame flickering across his features, and in the corner of the room, Clara's small figure appeared in the doorway, watching as the tide finally, irrevocably turned. The room seemed to shrink after Judge Parker's words fell like a hammer on the table. Harris's face drained of color, his chest rising and falling too quickly, while Blake stood stiff at the wall, looking as though he wished he could disappear into it. Maya felt the heat of vindication burn in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She sat still, her hands folded together now that they were free, her back straight, her expression calm. She wasn't going to gloat. That wasn't her way. The silence in the room was louder than any argument could have been, and Harris's silence was the most telling of all. "Get these papers out of my sight," Parker barked, shoving the intake forms aside. His eyes burned holes into Harris. "You dragged a federal attorney into this room, handcuffed her in public, humiliated her in the very courthouse she was assigned to protect, and you didn't bother to check her plates, her background, or even her office upstairs." Harris opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came. She didn't have ID," he stammered finally, his voice thin. "She was acting suspicious. We were just following." "You weren't following anything but your own prejudice," Parker cut in sharply. His hand slammed down on the table, making Blake flinch. "Don't you dare hide behind procedure when you ignored every single one at your disposal." Maya's gaze drifted briefly toward Clara, who still stood near the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Their eyes met for a second, and Maya gave the faintest nod of acknowledgement. Clara had known. Clara had tried. And now, with the truth spilling into the open, Maya felt a small swell of gratitude that someone, at least, had recognized her before the storm broke. Parker's voice filled the room again. "You will report to my office after this, Sergeant. We'll be having a very long discussion with the chief about your future here." "Yes, Your Honor," Harris muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. The bravado he had carried like armor only minutes earlier now hung in tatters around him. But Maya wasn't interested in Harris's collapse. Her anger wasn't for him alone. It was for every person who had been marched through these halls, labeled a suspect first and a citizen second, without the power or title to prove otherwise. She thought of the faces she had seen from the bench, the defendants who had whispered that no one listened when they spoke. Now she knew, in a way that was visceral and personal, just how deep that silence cut. Miguel's phone buzzed quietly against his palm where he stood near the hallway. He had been recording since the cuffs clicked shut in the lobby. Now, as Judge Parker's declaration echoed, "You just handcuffed the United States federal attorney," the words captured on his screen sent a chill through him. He hesitated only a moment before pressing send. The video shot across networks faster than any of them could have imagined. Inside the holding room, the shift was palpable. Blake cleared his throat softly, his voice halting. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Maya directly for the first time. I didn't know. I'm sorry." Maya studied him, her face unreadable. She had seen that look before. Regret born not from empathy but from exposure, from the fear of consequences. "You should have," she said quietly. "That's the point." The weight of her words hung in the air. Parker looked at her, his eyes softening slightly, then turned back to the officers. "Get out," he ordered. "Now." Harris and Blake shuffled toward the door, their postures stripped of the authority they had wielded so carelessly. Clara stepped aside to let them pass, her eyes steady, unflinching. When the door closed behind them, the room felt different, lighter somehow, though the sting of humiliation still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Parker pulled out a chair and sat across from Maya, his tone gentler now. "You shouldn't have gone through that," he said. "Not here, not anywhere." Maya's jaw tightened. "But I did, and so do others, every day." He nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. "We'll deal with them, and we'll deal with this. But I need to know, are you all right?" Her eyes dropped briefly to her wrists, still marked red from the cuffs. She flexed her fingers slowly, then met his gaze again. "I'll be fine. What matters is what happens next." From the hallway, the murmur of voices grew louder. The crowd in the lobby had not dispersed. They were buzzing now, passing the story from mouth to mouth, the disbelief rippling outward like a tide. Miguel slipped his phone into his pocket, heart racing. By the time Maya stood from her chair, the video he had uploaded had already begun to spread. Across the courthouse, phones buzzed, screens lit up, and the truth that Harris had tried to bury now had wings. Maya walked out of the room with her head high, Parker beside her. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh now, the corridor less suffocating. But as they approached the lobby doors, the hum of voices grew into a roar. She knew before she even stepped through that the humiliation she had endured in silence had become something else entirely. The moment she emerged into the light of the lobby, the crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some stepped back, ashamed for having stood silent earlier. Others pulled out their phones, already aware of what had happened. The weight of their stares was different now. Not suspicion, not disdain, but shock, even guilt. Maya paused at the top of the steps, her eyes sweeping across the faces turned toward her. She did not smile. She did not bow her head. She simply stood, letting them see her for who she was, and for what they had chosen not to see until it was too late. The truth was out now, no longer trapped in the small room where Harris's arrogance had tried to contain it. And as the crowd shifted, whispers turning into a chorus, Maya felt the air shift with it. What had begun as her humiliation was no longer hers alone. It had become a reckoning. The noise hit her first, a swell of voices, some gasping, some murmuring with disbelief, others already carrying the story like wildfire across the marble lobby. Phones were raised in trembling hands, the faint glow of screens recording every step she took. Maya walked with Parker beside her, his jaw tight, his presence protective but not overbearing. She didn't need a shield. She needed them to see her as she was, unflinching, unbroken. The cuffs were gone, but the angry red marks still circled her wrists like bruised shadows. People stared at them, then back at her face, as though trying to reconcile the image of the woman they had seen humiliated minutes earlier with the truth now unfolding before them. She felt the sting of their silence more than the sting of the steel. Not one of them had spoken up when Harris dragged her across this very floor. They had watched, eyes wide, lips pressed, complicit in their stillness. Now their silence cracked under the weight of realization. Miguel was among them, his phone buzzing in his pocket as notifications poured in faster than he could read them. The video he had sent out was already climbing across social networks, the headline practically writing itself. Federal attorney handcuffed in her own courthouse. His hands shook, but he stood tall, watching Maya take her place on the steps as if history itself were catching its breath. Judge Parker gestured for quiet, but Maya lifted her hand slightly. "No," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, steady as a stone dropped into water. The lobby stilled, the buzz fading into a hush, all ears tilting toward her. She let the silence linger just long enough for it to cut. "This isn't about me," she began, her voice clear, unwavering. "It's about what you all saw. It's about every person who has been treated like a suspect first and a citizen last." Her words sliced through the marble air. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked at their shoes. The weight of her gaze pressed on them, not accusing, but undeniable. She wasn't just speaking to the people gathered here. She was speaking to every person who would watch that video later, every stranger who would recognize their own humiliation in her story. "I was cuffed today because I didn't fit the picture of who belongs in these halls. Not because of the law, not because of procedure, but because of assumption." She lifted her wrists, showing the faint marks to the crowd. "And if this can happen to me, imagine how many others it happens to who don't have the power or the title to fight back." The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the faint click of cameras capturing her every word. She didn't flinch at them. Let them record. Let them remember. In the back of the crowd, Harris stood rigid, his face pale, the arrogance drained from his features. He wanted to disappear, but the eyes of the crowd pinned him in place. Every whisper pointed at him. Every phone lens caught his failure. Blake hovered nearby, his shoulders slumped, shame written across his posture. Maya turned slightly toward them, her eyes locking on Harris. "You thought dragging me away would silence me," she said, "but all you did was prove my point. Power doesn't make you right, and silence doesn't make you safe." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clapped hesitantly, then louder, until the sound filled the lobby. It wasn't applause for her position or her authority. It was the sound of recognition, the crack in the veneer of indifference that had coated the morning. Miguel's phone buzzed again, a flood of messages lighting up the screen. Thousands of views, tens of thousands. The video had leapt beyond the courthouse into the hands of a public hungry for justice. Parker placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, steady but firm. "That's enough for today," he murmured, though his eyes held a glint of pride. Maya looked at the faces staring at her, the clerks, the lawyers, the citizens waiting for hearings, the ones who had watched her humiliation in silence. She knew this wasn't over. Today was only the beginning. But she had taken back the narrative, turned her disgrace into something bigger than herself. She stepped down from the landing, the crowd parting like a tide. They watched her pass not with suspicion this time, but with a weight of awareness that hadn't been there before. Harris shrank into the corner, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, but there was no swagger left in him. Not here. Not now. As Maya walked through the courthouse doors into the daylight, the roar of the city greeted her. Reporters had already begun to gather, cameras flashing, questions hurled into the air. She didn't answer them. She simply paused on the steps, letting the light fall across her face, her expression calm and resolute. Behind her, the courthouse loomed, its stone facade suddenly less like a temple of justice and more like a reminder of the work still ahead. She knew the fight wouldn't end with Harris. It wouldn't end with this video. But for the first time that day, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift towards something truer, something stronger. And as the applause still echoed faintly behind her, Maya Richardson knew the story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and to everyone who had stood by in silence and now had to reckon with what they had seen. The courthouse steps were crowded by the time Maya reached the bottom. Reporters shouted questions over one another, their cameras flashing in rapid bursts. The air outside was thick with energy, the kind that comes when a story has already outrun the people living it. Her name was spreading, her face on 100 screens before she even had the chance to draw her next breath. Still, she didn't slow down, didn't offer words for the microphones thrust toward her. She kept moving, the heat of the cuffs still imprinted in her skin, the sting of humiliation still burning behind her composure. Inside, the situation was unraveling faster than anyone could control. The lobby buzzed with tension as officers tried to disperse the crowd, but whispers had turned into open outrage. Miguel's video was making its rounds, replayed on phones held up in clusters. People gasped again when they heard Parker's words on the recording. "You just handcuffed the United States federal attorney assigned to this courthouse." Every time the sentence echoed from a speaker, Harris's career crumbled further. By mid-afternoon, the chief of police arrived, summoned by Parker himself. Chief Donovan was a tall man with graying hair and a weary look, as if years of putting out fires like this one had carved permanent lines into his face. He stood in the center of the lobby, reporters swarming at the edges, his voice cutting through the chaos. "On behalf of the department, I want to apologize to Miss Richardson for what occurred here today. The actions taken against her were unacceptable, and we are placing both officers involved on immediate suspension pending investigation." The words drew a collective gasp. Harris, standing to the side with his jaw locked, looked as though he might combust, his hands fisted at his sides, his eyes narrowing at Maya where she stood near Parker. Blake stood beside him, pale and stiff, his shame heavier than the badge on his chest. Maya didn't move. She stood still, listening, her arms crossed lightly, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything yet. The public apology was necessary, but it wasn't the closure she sought. It was too neat, too practiced. She wanted to hear them admit not only that they were wrong, but why. Chief Donovan turned to her, his tone measured. "Miss Richardson, I assure you this matter will be addressed swiftly. The department takes racial bias and misconduct with the utmost seriousness." Her voice finally broke the silence, low but firm. "You say that now because you have no choice. Because there are cameras rolling and a video you can't bury. But what about yesterday? And the day before? How many people like me walked into this building and were treated as criminals before they even had a chance to speak?" The words stung the air. Even Parker shifted, his stern face softening as though he knew she was right. Donovan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew every word she spoke was already being broadcast. The crowd outside the courthouse was swelling. Chants began faintly, carried from the street, "No more cuffs! No more cuffs!" The sound rose, filling the air with rhythm, with anger, with something bigger than one woman's humiliation. Maya listened to it, let it roll over her like a tide. She wasn't the cause, she realized. She was the spark. The fire had been waiting a long time to burn. Harris finally broke, his voice sharp and defensive. "She had no ID. She looked suspicious. What was I supposed to do? Just take her word for it?" "You were supposed to follow procedure," Maya cut in, her tone sharp enough to slice through his excuse. "You were supposed to run the plates, check the system, ask questions before deciding who I was. But you didn't. You saw me and you judged me, and today it backfired." The silence that followed was suffocating. Harris's face burned red, his mouth open as if he wanted to spit another excuse, but the weight of the crowd bore down on him. Phones pointed at him, capturing his every twitch, his every failed defense. For once, the badge on his chest offered no shield. Blake finally spoke, his voice small but audible. "She's right, Sergeant. We should have checked. We should have listened." His admission sent a ripple through the room. Harris turned on him, betrayal flashing across his face, but Blake held his ground. "You didn't let me do my job. You only cared about making her fit what you already believed." The chief's voice cut back in, grave and final. "That's enough. Both of you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Hand over your badges." Blake's hands shook as he unclipped his badge and set it down on the table, his eyes flicking briefly to Maya with something close to apology. Harris stood frozen, his fists tight, his breath ragged. It took Parker's sharp order for him to finally rip the badge from his chest and slam it down, the sound echoing like a nail driven into a coffin. Maya watched the scene unfold, her face unreadable but her mind racing. This was accountability, yes, but not justice. Firing two men wouldn't fix the system that allowed them to drag her across that lobby. It wouldn't undo the humiliation she had endured in silence or erase the countless others who hadn't had a camera pointed at them to tell their side. When the chief and Parker turned back to her, she spoke once more, her voice calm but resolute. "Don't think this ends here. Don't think suspensions and apologies are enough. You owe this city more than that, and I intend to make sure you give it." The crowd erupted in applause, louder than before, the chants outside surging until the walls vibrated with the sound. Maya stood in the center of it, steady and unflinching, her wrists still bearing the red marks of the morning, but her presence larger than the walls around her. This wasn't over. It was only the first step, and every person in that building knew it. The courthouse was quieter a week later, though the memory of that day still hung in its marble halls like smoke that refused to clear. Maya returned with her head high, her heels clicking against the polished floor, no longer in gym clothes, but in a dark tailored suit that carried the weight of her title as plainly as her nameplate on the door upstairs. The whispers followed her still, but they were different now. People looked at her with a kind of reverence mixed with unease, as though seeing her for the first time after pretending she wasn't there all along. She passed the lobby where it had all begun. The memory struck her sharply, her hands yanked behind her back, the cuffs biting into her skin, the silence of the bystanders. The sting of it had not faded. She doubted it ever would. But now, where the shame once sat heavy, there was purpose. She carried it like armor. Upstairs, a meeting room had been prepared. Chief Donovan sat at the far end of the long oak table, his face grave, flanked by several department officials. Judge Parker sat to his right, his expression as firm as ever, though his eyes softened when they met Maya's. Clara was there too, seated near the back with a notebook open, her posture stiff but her gaze steady. Miguel had been invited as well, though he looked nervous, tapping his phone on the table, as if still unsure what role he played in all this. Harris was absent. His termination had been signed the day before. Blake had resigned quietly, slipping out of the spotlight before it consumed him whole. Maya took her seat at the table, folding her hands in front of her. The chief cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Miss Richardson, thank you for joining us today. After last week's events, it's clear we have serious issues to address. The department is launching an internal review and mandatory training programs on racial bias and proper procedure. We'd like you to take part in the oversight committee to ensure transparency." She studied him for a long moment, letting his words hang in the air. She'd heard promises before. She'd seen press conferences and statements crafted to soothe outrage. She had no use for empty gestures. "Chief," she said finally, her tone calm but sharp, "this isn't about training sessions or new manuals. It's about culture. It's about how easy it was for two officers to see me as a suspect instead of an attorney, and how no one in the lobby spoke up while they dragged me away. That doesn't change with a few hours in a classroom." Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "I agree, which is why we want your perspective. You've seen the flaws from both sides. Help us change it from within." Clara spoke up, her voice soft but steady. "She's right. It's bigger than procedure. If people don't believe the law applies equally, none of this matters. It'll just happen again." All eyes turned to Maya. She leaned back in her chair, her wrists unconsciously brushing against one another, the memory of steel still fresh on her skin. "I'll take the seat on your committee," she said, "but not as decoration, not as a name you can put on a press release. If I do this, I bring the community with me. Every story I've already heard since that video spread, people stop me in the street, in coffee shops, telling me their own humiliations. I'll carry those into this room. You'll hear them, whether you want to or not." The chief nodded slowly. "Understood." Miguel cleared his throat, his young voice trembling slightly. "That video, it wasn't just about what happened to you. People are watching it and saying, 'That's me. That could have been me.' I've never seen anything spread that fast. It's bigger than all of us." Maya's eyes met his, and she gave him the smallest nod of thanks. He had taken a risk pressing record. Without him, she might still be just another humiliation buried inside those walls. The meeting stretched on, filled with discussion and promises, some of which rang hollow, some of which carried weight. But when it ended, and Maya stepped out of the room into the bright light of the hallway, she felt something settle in her chest. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a longer one, harder and heavier, but hers to tell. She walked back through the lobby, past the doors where Harris had once dragged her, past the benches where silent faces had watched. This time people rose as she passed. Some nodded, some whispered her name. A few clapped softly, almost reverently. She didn't slow her pace. She wasn't there for applause. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting the courthouse in golden light. The crowd that had gathered was smaller now, quieter, but their presence still carried meaning. Signs from last week's protests leaned against the steps, weathered by rain but not forgotten. Maya stopped for a moment on the steps, looking out at the city beyond. The scars on her wrists itched faintly, a reminder of what had been taken from her that day, but also of what had been built in its place. Clara joined her on the steps, standing a few feet away. "You turned it around," she said softly. Maya shook her head. "No, I just showed them what was already there." She looked out at the horizon, her voice firm but quiet. "The fight's not over. It never is. But at least now they'll have to listen." The last light of the day washed across her face as she turned and walked down the courthouse steps. Behind her, the building loomed tall and silent, a monument to justice both betrayed and reclaimed. Ahead, the road stretched long, uncertain, but hers to walk. And with each step, Maya Richardson carried not only her own story, but the voices of countless others, determined that the silence which once let injustice thrive would never again be enough to stop her.